Meccano, part number P31, wing stay from the 1930s aeroplane constructor set. Hi folks and welcome back. This week we have no real world firsts, the great attempt to bag a hat that nobody had bagged before. In fact, to be honest, the aircraft today are from the 1930s and a time when the firsts seem to pretty much be done. Well, nearly all of them. Today's script is about what we take for granted when we fly, and that's partly the power beneath the wings. After all, if you can't lift the body of the airframe up and keep it up there where the birds own the territory, gravity has a nasty habit of reminding us of our own mortality in a rather nasty way. There were two great barriers that split the world up in the time of early aviation: the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And in some ways the Pacific is the easier of the two to fly, as you can hug land all the way around it. Not so over the Atlantic. The late 1920s and the early 1930s saw the beginning of air transportation really take off. But the question was, how do you jump a barrier of water that measures 3,500 miles, London to New York, 4,000 miles, Spain to New York, or even at its thinnest point, North Africa to South America, 2,500 miles. It's the reason behind the Dornier X flying boat and the French mail planes. You really were stepping off into the unknown. This flight was very dangerous, hence the logic behind the flying boats. At least if you came down, you were in a boat. But this was hazardous. Aircraft are right at the edge of their operating ranges. Even something as simple as a headwind could change your ability from doing to not doing very quickly. As early as 1913, an idea was floated as to how to solve this problem by a Canadian-American engineer. And even though his ideas were never to come to anything, his design has been worked on and is now the infrastructure behind our very way of life. His life work, almost, was the seadrome, a series of floating airports across the Atlantic. Edward Robert Armstrong was born in 1876 in Guelph, Ontario. Around 1913, he started to try to address the problem of how to cross the Atlantic with an aeroplane. What followed was a 30-year fight to get his plans funded, and ultimately he failed. But if he hadn't, air travel would have been very different pre-World War II. Reading the source material on this just leaves me in awe. The amount of engineering needed to build the seadrome is huge. But yet his design, in its simplicity, was a sound design. But there is more going on here than just a floating airport. Armstrong, in his work with DuPont in the early to mid-1920s, was involved in the building of floating factories to extract bromine from seawater. His grasp on wave action was at least 40 years ahead of his time, as the study of wave action was a product of the submarine warfare of the Second World War, being carried out in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The design of the seadrome would have been an open lattice work design very similar to a modern day oil rigs. The main deck would be 100 foot above sea level and would descend 185 feet beneath sea level, where the wave action wouldn't affect the platform. The runway length would be 900 foot and 240 foot wide. In the middle section, this would be increased to 400 foot to allow for hotels and other services, while hangars for maintenance and refuelling would be beneath the deck and would be accessible via lifts. This gives a landing area of around 6 acres. To prove the theory, Armstrong built a scale model of the landing platform along with a liner SS Majestic and floated it in a swimming pool with the addition of a fan to provide scale waves up to 45 foot. He proved the seadrome stayed stable and the SS Majestic was swamped by the sea. The plan was to put a main seadrome every 400 miles, around 8 in total, and then a further 9 smaller seadromes dispersed between them. Each base will have a SAR or search and rescue capability and a radio location beam transmitted for aircraft to follow to the next seadrome. They would require 10,000 tons of steel to build. The total weight would be around 50,000 tons and cost £300,000 each to build. One of the greatest engineering problems was that of anchorage mid-Atlantic to stop the platforms drifting away. The depth that Armstrong was dealing with is around 2 miles. That would require an anchor chain of 6 miles. The best practice being that of an anchor chain length of 3 times what you actually need. In the end, he solved this by anchoring the seadrome to a large spar buoy. The other problem was that of funding. In the early 1930s, Armstrong, along with DuPont, and the Sun Shipbuilding Company, owned by Shell Oil Limited, had finally won backing from the US government to build the first of the seadromes. Having been awarded $1.5 million, testing could go ahead. But as the Great Depression steadily increased, the plan was quietly dropped, as the envisaged cost of $12 million was a price tag that was a bit on the hefty side. In modern equivalent, that's around $156 million, and we all know that projects of this size rarely come in on budget. In the end, there was another event that took away the need of the airports, that of the Second World War, as finally, in the heat of the furnace of the conflict, better engines were developed. The seadromes would have seen around 4,000 to 6,000 people living in the Atlantic in a semi-permanent fashion, and each seadrome having around 3,000 people pass through daily. Had the Atlantic seadromes been built, it would have allowed for a safe transit corridor during the Second World War for convoy escort, as a vital air cover in the form of active CAP combat air patrols could have operated for the whole crossing. And for nearly 60 years, the idea has disappeared. But the idea of floating airports has been cited again. Probably the greatest benefit to come out of Armstrong's work is that of offshore drilling, as many of the concept designs for the seadrome's manufacture has been the base model for the modern drilling platforms that we see now. With one of the fundamental principles being that of ease of manufacture to allow the seadromes to be built in any shipworks anywhere in the world. What Armstrong witnessed was 2 paradigm shifts. The first was that of the internal combustion engine, and the second was that of air transport using heavier than air flight. When he first started designing the seadrome in 1913, the idea of heavier than air flight crossing the Atlantic was pure science fiction. By the 1920s, the airship seemed more than capable of fending off the unwanted advances of aeroplanes. And by the last time he tried to put the idea to military command in 1943, there was no point. The Battle of the Atlantic was all but over by 1941, known as the First Happy Time. and was stopped by the Royal Navy's bravery to enter sinking U-boats to rescue code books and Enigma machines, and the work carried out at Bletchley Park to decode them. The second happy time was January of 1942 to August of 1942. Picking on the United States Navy might not have been a good idea. It's a bit like walking into a Newcastle United pub wearing a Sunderland top. Your odds of getting out in one piece are set against you. So why 100 years on are we looking at floating airports again? The answer is very simple. It's that of real estate. We don't have the space available anymore to build large airports in our cities. This problem was first cited in 1921 by Captain C. Frobisher, when he foresaw the problem with airports in London. And as we use very little of the surface of the water covering our planet for anything but wind farms and fish farms, then maybe the idea of a floating airport is not a bad idea. And several ideas have been put forward, with San Diego being one. But this was sunk in 2003 for a number of reasons, cost being one, the logistical resupply being another, security and the impact on the environment. And I think the logistical resupply would have been the greatest flaw in Armstrong's design. After all, he would need to get enough fuel to 17 seadromes, food and other consumables for both crew and passengers, diesel for generators and spare parts. On top of this, what would happen in mid-winter when the metal decks are covered with ice and you're coming into land, assuming you've even made it that far out? Cost is, I think, one of the biggest factors, though, because as with Gensler and the Thames Estuary Research and Development proposal to float a 6-runway project in the middle of the Thames Estuary, the outlay of $63 billion is rather a large pill to swallow for any government.